The first blow came without warning. Officer Jason Bradford's palm connecting with the side of Victoria Hayes's face so hard that her $400 sunglasses shattered against the concrete, and blood filled her mouth from where her teeth cut into her cheek, and she could hear her own voice, distant and strange, asking, "Why are you doing this?" While his partner, Officer Ryan Mitchell, wrenched her arms behind her back with enough force that her shoulder socket screamed, and something popped that would later require surgery. The Georgia summer sun beat down on the parking lot of the Publix supermarket in Buckhead, Atlanta's most affluent neighborhood, where Victoria had stopped to grab groceries after a morning of depositions, still wearing her charcoal gray Armani suit and cream silk blouse. Her natural hair styled in a professional twist-out that was now coming undone, as Mitchell forced her face first onto the hood of her black Mercedes S-Class that still had the engine running and NPR playing an interview about criminal justice, reform through the open driver's door. Bradford was yelling something about her being a smart-mouthed suspect who needed to learn respect, his spit landing on her cheek as he pressed her head down harder, and Victoria felt the grocery bag she'd been holding split open, organic apples, and a carton of almond milk rolling across the parking lot, while a crowd of Saturday afternoon shoppers stood frozen with their carts. Phones emerging from pockets and purses to capture every second of what would become the most explosive video in Georgia's recent history. Victoria Hayes had been the state attorney for Fulton County for 4 years, had prosecuted everyone from gang members to corrupt politicians with equal tenacity, had a conviction rate of 87% that was the highest in the state, and had been profiled by the New York Times just 3 months ago as one of the most effective prosecutors in the American South. She told Bradford and Mitchell this exactly 4 times in the 90 seconds since they'd approached her car with hands on their weapons, and ordered her out with the kind of aggression usually reserved for armed robbery suspects. But her words had bounced off their certainty like rain off steel. When she'd reached slowly for her identification, following every protocol she taught in community forums about surviving police encounters, Bradford had grabbed her wrist and twisted it while Mitchell had drawn his weapon and screamed at her to stop reaching, even though she'd announced every movement before making it. The IDs were scattered now too, her driver's license and state attorney badge in their leather case lying face down near a storm drain, close enough that she could see them, but too far to reach with her face, pressed against hot metal and handcuffs, biting into her wrists hard enough that she could feel her pulse throbbing against the steel. The crowd was growing, voices rising in confusion and anger, and Victoria could hear a woman shouting, "She told you who she was, she told you." While someone else was demanding to know what crime had been committed, what justification existed for this level of force against a woman in professional attire who'd been loading groceries into her car. Bradford turned to the crowd and announced with absolute confidence that she was being arrested for shoplifting, that store security had reported a black female stealing expensive items, and that her fancy car and clothes were probably stolen too, given the neighborhood and the type of person who usually drove vehicles like that. The accusation was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that Victoria almost laughed except her broken rib, the one that would later show up on x-rays as a clean fracture from the initial impact against her car, made breathing difficult and laughing impossible. She'd spent $300 on organic groceries and had the receipt in her pocket, had paid with the credit card that bore her name and had smiled at the cashier, a young black man named Deshaun who she now spotted in the growing crowd, his face pale with horror as he held up his phone and yelled that she paid, that he'd checked her out himself, that this was wrong. Mitchell was going through her purse now, dumping the contents onto the hood next to her face, and Victoria watched her world spill out in intimate detail for strangers to witness and record. Her prescription bottle for blood pressure medication that she'd needed since her husband died 2 years ago from a heart attack at 49. Her daughter's college ID that she carried as a good luck charm, even though Jasmine was in her second year at Howard University. The photos in her wallet of her mother who'd passed from cancer, her father who'd raised her alone in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta after that loss, her little brother Marcus, who was a civil rights attorney in D.C. and would lose his mind when he found out about this. Her lipstick, her reading glasses, her work phone that was buzzing incessantly because her office was trying to reach her about the press conference scheduled for 3 o'clock that afternoon. The press conference, where she was supposed to announce the results of a 2-year investigation into police corruption in the Atlanta metro area. Bradford found her badge before Mitchell did, the leather case flipping open to reveal her official state attorney identification with her photo and the seal of Georgia embossed in gold. And Victoria watched his expression cycle through confusion, recognition, and then something worse than either. The realization that he'd made a catastrophic mistake, followed immediately by the decision to double down rather than admit error. "Badge is probably fake," he announced loud enough for his body camera to catch it, loud enough for the crowd to hear, loud enough that the lie could be preserved in whatever report he filed later. "We'll let them verify it at the station. She's still under arrest for shoplifting and resisting." The second charge was new, invented in real time to justify the force he'd used, and Victoria felt the cold clarity that came from years of prosecution settle over her shock and pain. Every word he said was evidence. Every action was being documented. Every decision was creating an unassailable record that would destroy him. But that knowledge didn't make the handcuffs looser or the pavement less hard when they dragged her toward their patrol car. The dragging was the worst part, worse than the hit or the twisted shoulder, because it was so nakedly intended to humiliate rather than transport. Mitchell had her by the arm and Bradford had grabbed the chain between the handcuffs, and they pulled her across the parking lot like she was cargo, her heels scraping against asphalt and her suit jacket tearing at the seam. An elderly white woman stepped forward from the crowd and put herself in their path, her voice shaking but firm as she said, "This is wrong. She's telling the truth. I know who she is." But Bradford brushed past her with enough force that she stumbled and had to catch herself on a shopping cart. A teenage boy, couldn't have been more than 16, was crying openly while filming, and Victoria made eye contact with him for just a second, tried to convey that this mattered, that his documentation mattered, that bearing witness was an act of resistance even when you couldn't stop what was happening. The news van arrived as they were shoving her into the back of the patrol car. Channel 5 WSB-TV with reporter Amanda Chen, who'd covered 3 of Victoria's major cases, and whose expression went from professional curiosity to absolute shock when she recognized who was being arrested. The back of the patrol car smelled like vomit and sweat, and the particular desperation of all the people who'd sat in this exact spot before her. And Victoria felt the full weight of every defendant she'd ever prosecuted, every plea bargain she'd offered, every sentence recommendation she'd made. She'd always believed she was fair, had always tried to see the humanity in the accused while still holding them accountable for their actions. But sitting here with her hands cuffed behind her back and her shoulder on fire and her face swelling from Bradford's blow, she wondered how many of the people she'd prosecuted had been telling the truth about their arrests. How many had said the police planted evidence or used excessive force or lied in their reports, and she dismissed it as the expected denials of the guilty. The doubt felt like betrayal of herself, of her principles, but it was also clarity, the kind that only comes from experiencing the system from the other side of the bars. Bradford and Mitchell were having an urgent conversation outside the car, their body language defensive and aggressive by turns, and Victoria could see Mitchell on his phone, probably calling their supervisor, probably trying to figure out how to handle the fact that they'd just assaulted and falsely arrested one of the most powerful prosecutors in Georgia. Amanda Chen was approaching them with her cameraman, microphone extended, and Bradford was waving her off while Mitchell turned his back to the camera. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, It had grown, with people from inside the Publix coming out to see what was happening, and Victoria could hear the murmur of conversation punctuated by the word attorney and state and lawsuit rising like a tide. Her work phone was still buzzing in her purse, which Mitchell had finally picked up and was carrying toward the patrol car, and she knew that her office was probably going into crisis mode, that her absence at the 3 o'clock press conference would trigger alarms, that the machine she'd built over 4 years was about to shift into a gear these officers couldn't imagine. The patrol car's radio crackled with an urgent call, and Victoria heard a voice she recognized. Captain William Morrison, the precinct commander and someone who'd sat through 5 of her presentations on proper arrest procedures and constitutional rights. Bradford Mitchell, what is your 20, and what is your situation? Morrison's voice had the careful neutrality of someone who'd already been told something concerning and was trying to verify it before losing his composure. Bradford grabbed the radio and responded with false confidence that they had a shoplifting suspect in custody and were transporting to the station. But before he could finish, Morrison cut him off with an edge in his voice that made Mitchell visibly flinch. Is your suspect a black female, approximately 5'7", wearing a gray suit, driving a black Mercedes S-Class? The description was too specific to be coincidence, which meant someone had already called it in, had already reported what was happening, and Bradford's silence stretched long enough that Morrison's next words came through like a hammer. Tell me you did not just arrest State Attorney Victoria Hayes. The moment hung suspended in the summer heat, humidity so thick you could taste it mixing with the smell of hot asphalt and the distant exhaust from Peachtree Road. And Victoria watched through the window as the color drained from both officers' faces in perfect synchronization. Mitchell actually took a step back from the car, his hand going to his mouth, but Bradford's jaw set in that stubborn line that Victoria had seen on 100 defendants who decided that commitment to a lie was preferable to admission of truth. Sir, the suspect claims to be State Attorney Hayes, but we have reasonable suspicion that she was engaged in shoplifting. And when we attempted to verify her identity, she became resistant and Morrison's voice cut through the lie like a blade through silk. She is State Attorney Hayes. I've got her office calling the chief. I've got a city councilman calling the mayor. And I've got social media blowing up with videos of you two assaulting her. Get those handcuffs off her immediately. Get me a supervisor on scene. And someone find me the store manager who supposedly reported a shoplifter, because I'm betting my pension that no such call exists. Bradford's hand shook as he opened the car door, and Victoria looked up at him with an expression that she'd perfected over years of cross-examination, the look that said she saw through every lie and evasion and would remember every detail when judgment came. Ma'am, there's been a misunderstanding, he started. And Victoria cut him off with a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority despite her position literally beneath him. Officer Bradford, you assaulted me. You falsely arrested me. You manufactured charges, and you did it all on camera with witnesses. The only misunderstanding is yours, believing that your badge would protect you from the consequences of those choices. She let the words hang there while he fumbled with the handcuff key. And when the metal finally released her wrists, she had to bite back a gasp at the pain of blood rushing back into her hands. The skin was broken in 2 places, blood on the steel, and she made sure to hold her wrists up as she exited the car, made sure Amanda Chen's camera caught the injuries in high definition. Captain Morrison arrived within 6 minutes, his squad car pulling into the parking lot with lights but no siren. And his face when he saw Victoria standing there with torn clothing and visible injuries was the face of a man calculating exactly how bad this was going to get. He'd been at her presentation on de-escalation tactics just 3 weeks ago, had shaken her hand and thanked her for her partnership with the police department, had posed for a photo that was probably still on the precinct's social media celebrating community relations. Victoria had actually liked Morrison, had thought he was one of the good ones trying to change the culture from within, but watching him approach her now with his damage control expression, She felt that assessment shifting. Good ones didn't supervise officers like Bradford and Mitchell without noticing the warning signs. Good ones didn't create an environment where this kind of arrest felt possible or justified to the officers under their command. Morrison was apologizing, his words tumbling over each other in a rush to contain what was rapidly becoming a public relations catastrophe and a legal nightmare. But Victoria held up her hand to stop him, and the gesture made her shoulder scream, but she kept her face neutral. "Captain Morrison, I don't want your apology. I want the name of the store manager who allegedly called in a shoplifting report about me. I want the dispatch recording of that call. I want both officers' body camera footage preserved and delivered to my office by end of business today. And I want the internal affairs investigation opened within the hour." She paused, letting each demand land. "And I want medical transport to Emory University Hospital so that my injuries can be documented and photographed by medical professionals. Because when I file the federal civil rights lawsuit against your officers and your department, I want the evidence to be unimpeachable." The crowd that was still watching, still recording, actually cheered at that, and Morrison looked like he wanted the asphalt to open up and swallow him. The ambulance arrived at the same time as the assistant chief, and Victoria refused to sit in the patrol car while waiting, instead standing in the parking lot with her ruined suit and her bleeding wrists and her swelling face, a living testament to everything that was wrong with the system she dedicated her life to reforming. The assistant chief was a black man named Thomas Wright, who'd been the department's public face for community relations, and who'd worked with Victoria on several community forums, and the anguish in his expression when he saw her was genuine in a way that Morrison's practiced concern wasn't. "Victoria, I am so profoundly sorry," he said quietly, using her first name because they'd shared enough panels and press conferences to move past formality, and she appreciated that he didn't insult her intelligence by calling it a misunderstanding or an unfortunate incident. "This is a catastrophic failure at every level, and I give you my word that there will be accountability." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, weighing sincerity against institutional protection, and finally nodded. "Thomas, your word matters to me, but you need to understand that this doesn't end with Bradford and Mitchell. This is about a culture that made them think this was acceptable. This is about every supervisor who saw warning signs and did nothing. This is about a system that I've been investigating for 2 years, and that just gave me the final piece of evidence I needed." That last sentence made Wright's expression shift from concern to comprehension to something that looked like resignation. "The 3 o'clock press conference," he said, and it wasn't a question. Victoria smiled, and it hurt her split lip, but she did it anyway. "The 3 o'clock press conference. The one where I was going to announce indictments against 17 officers across 4 precincts for corruption, excessive force, and civil rights violations. The one that's now going to include detailed analysis of my own arrest as Exhibit A for why those indictments are necessary. The one that's going to be covered by every major news outlet in the country, because the story just became state attorney arrested while investigating police, instead of just state attorney announces police indictments." She watched understanding cascade across his features. "Your officers didn't just assault me, Thomas. They handed me the most powerful piece of evidence I could have asked for. That mistake would cost the Atlanta Police Department $470 million in settlements, reforms, and federal oversight over the next 3 years. But in that moment, standing in a Publix parking lot with paramedics approaching, and cameras still rolling, and her entire body aching from violations that would take months to fully heal from, Victoria wasn't thinking about the financial cost. She was thinking about Marcus Williams, the 23-year-old who'd been beaten so badly during a traffic stop that he'd suffered permanent brain damage, whose case was part of the indictments, and whose mother had held Victoria's hand and begged her to make sure it meant something. She was thinking about Destiny Johnson, 15 years old, who'd been strip-searched on the side of the road because an officer suspected she was hiding drugs, and who'd attempted suicide twice after the trauma. She was thinking about Robert Chen, the immigrant small business owner who'd been robbed by officers in uniform who'd known he wouldn't report it because of his immigration status, until Victoria's investigators had found him and promised protection. She was thinking about every person who'd experienced what she was experiencing now, but without her education, her position, her resources to fight back. The paramedics were professional and gentle, documenting her injuries with the thoroughness of people who recognized that this was going to be evidence in a major case. Fractured rib, likely fractured cheekbone, dislocated shoulder that they had to manipulate back into place right there in the parking lot, with a procedure so painful that Victoria bit through her lip to keep from screaming. Lacerations on both wrists, contusions on her face and arms, and a concussion from when Bradford had initially struck her that explained the persistent headache and the slight double vision. They wanted to take her to the hospital immediately, but Victoria insisted on stopping by her office first, insisted on making the 3 o'clock press conference even though the lead paramedic, a woman named Sharon who looked at Victoria with a mixture of concern and understanding, strongly advised against it. "Ma'am, you need medical care and rest," Sharon said gently while securing Victoria's shoulder in a sling. "Whatever you need to do can wait a few hours." But Victoria shook her head carefully, mindful of the concussion. "Sharon, if I don't show up to that press conference, the narrative becomes about me being too injured or too traumatized to continue. The story becomes about victim recovery instead of systemic accountability. I need to control this narrative while it's still forming." The drive to the Fulton County Courthouse was surreal. Victoria in the back of the ambulance with Sharon monitoring her vitals while Amanda Chen's news van followed, and the social media eruption that Morrison had mentioned became a full-scale wildfire. The video from the parking lot, filmed by at least 8 different people, was already trending on Twitter with hashtags like Justice for Victoria and Arrest These Officers and Police Brutality, had been viewed 3 million times in the 45 minutes since the arrest, and was being picked up by national news outlets with shocking speed. CNN was calling her office. MSNBC had already started a breaking news segment. The New York Times reporter who'd profiled Victoria 3 months ago was texting her communications director asking for comment. And the mayor of Atlanta had released a statement calling the arrest deeply troubling and promising a full investigation, though Victoria noticed the statement was carefully worded to avoid admitting city liability. Her office was chaos when she arrived at 2:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled press conference, and her staff's reactions ranged from horror to fury to tears. Her chief deputy, a brilliant black woman named Angela Thompson, who'd been Victoria's right hand for 3 years, actually had to leave the room when she saw Victoria's injuries, her composure finally breaking after holding together the office through the crisis. Victoria's communications director, James Park, a Korean-American man who'd managed press for the governor before joining her team, was simultaneously coordinating the press conference and fielding calls from what seemed like every media outlet in North America. And her senior investigator, former FBI agent Michael Rodriguez, was already pulling together the evidence from her arrest, making calls to witnesses, ensuring that Deshaun the cashier and the elderly woman and the teenage boy who'd filmed would all have their statements taken and preserved before anyone could pressure them into silence. Victoria had 17 minutes to make herself presentable, which meant changing into the spare suit she kept in her office, a navy blue Tahari that fit well enough despite being bought 2 years and 1 size ago. Makeup was impossible with her swelling face, so she didn't even try, just pulled her hair back into a low bun that didn't put pressure on the bruises. The sling stayed on because trying to hide her injuries would be interpreted as weakness or shame, and she felt neither. She felt angry, focused, and more certain of her purpose than she'd been since her husband died, and she'd thrown herself into work as a distraction from grief. Angela returned with her eyes red but her spine steel, and she helped Victoria prepare her statement, adding details from the arrest to the speech Victoria had written over the past week about the indictments. At 3 o'clock exactly, Victoria walked to the podium in the courthouse's main press room, and the flash of cameras was like lightning, so bright and constant that she had to pause to let her concussed brain adjust. The room was packed beyond capacity, reporters standing along the walls, camera crews from local and national outlets creating a forest of lenses and microphones. And in the back, she spotted Thomas Wright standing with the police chief and several other department brass who'd clearly realized that their presence was politically necessary, even if personally uncomfortable. Victoria gripped the podium with her good hand and looked out at the assembled media with the calm authority of someone who'd done this 100 times, even though every nerve in her body was screaming from pain and adrenaline. At approximately 1:15 this afternoon, I was assaulted and falsely arrested by officers Jason Bradford and Ryan Mitchell of the Atlanta Police Department, she began, her voice steady despite the throbbing in her head. I was struck in the face, thrown against my vehicle, handcuffed to the point of injury, and charged with shoplifting and resisting arrest despite having committed no crime. I identified myself as state attorney multiple times. I showed my credentials. I explained that I had paid for my groceries and had the receipt to prove it. None of that mattered to officers who had decided, based on my race and their assumptions, that I was a criminal who needed to be subdued with force. The silence in the room was absolute, every reporter hanging on every word. I'm sharing this not because I want sympathy, but because I want context for what I'm about to announce, and because I want you to understand that what happened to me today happens to people in this city, in this state, in this country, every single day. The only difference is that I have a title and a platform and resources to fight back. Most people don't. Victoria clicked to the first slide in her presentation, a photograph of Marcus Williams before his beating, a young man with bright eyes and a college acceptance letter to Georgia Tech. This is Marcus Williams. 2 years ago, he was pulled over for a broken taillight. 45 minutes later, he was in a coma with severe brain damage. The officers involved claimed he attacked them. The body camera footage, which mysteriously malfunctioned, would have told a different story. Click to the next slide, showing Destiny Johnson's school photo. This is Destiny Johnson. She was strip-searched on the side of I-85 because an officer claimed she fit the description of a robbery suspect. She was 15. The suspect was 40. Destiny has not returned to school since the incident and is currently in intensive therapy for PTSD. Click to the next slide. Robert Chen standing in his vandalized store. This is Robert Chen. His business was robbed by uniformed officers who took $23,000 and destroyed his security system. He didn't report it because he was afraid of deportation. We found him through community outreach. Slide after slide, face after face, Victoria told the stories of the 17 victims whose cases had led to the indictment she was announcing, and she watched the reporter's expressions shift from professional interest to genuine horror as the pattern became undeniable. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic. This was cultural. This was a failure at every level of oversight and accountability. And then she displayed the indictments themselves, names and charges and evidence summaries that filled slide after slide. Officers with years of experience and spotless official records who had complaints buried, lawsuits settled with NDAs, and warning signs ignored by supervisors who valued loyalty over legality. 17 officers across 4 precincts are being indicted today on charges ranging from assault under color of authority to evidence tampering to civil rights violations, Victoria announced, and the room erupted with questions that she ignored to continue her statement. These indictments represent 2 years of investigation conducted jointly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice. They represent thousands of hours of witness interviews, document review, and evidence analysis. and they represent a culture within the Atlanta Police Department that has prioritized protecting officers over protecting citizens. She paused, making eye contact with Thomas Wright in the back. My arrest today will be added to this investigation as additional evidence of that culture. Officers Bradford and Mitchell are now subjects of both internal affairs and federal civil rights investigations, and I will be filing a personal civil rights lawsuit against them, their supervisors, and the city of Atlanta for the violations I experienced. The questions came like a flood after that, reporters shouting over each other to be heard, but Victoria methodically called on each one and answered with the precision of someone who'd anticipated every angle. Yes, she would be recusing herself from prosecuting her own case, but had already contacted the Georgia Attorney General to request a special prosecutor. Yes, she had suffered significant injuries and would be going to the hospital immediately after the press conference. Yes, she believed this was retaliation for her investigation, though proving that would require establishing that Bradford and Mitchell knew who she was, which was why the dispatch recordings and body camera footage were so critical. No, she would not be resigning or stepping back from her duties. No, she did not believe all police officers were corrupt, but she did believe the system protected corrupt officers at the expense of good ones and citizens alike. Yes, she was absolutely certain of her evidence and welcomed any scrutiny because the truth was the truth regardless of who examined it. Amanda Chen got the last question, asking it with the kind of directness that Victoria had always appreciated. State Attorney Hayes, how does it feel to experience as a victim the same system you've prosecuted within for your entire career? Victoria considered the question, really thought about it despite the pain and exhaustion pulling at her consciousness, and answered with more honesty than she'd planned. It feels like a betrayal and a revelation at the same time. Betrayal because I believed, or wanted to believe, that my position and my credentials would insulate me from the kind of prejudice and assumptions that led to my arrest. Revelation because experiencing the system from this side has shown me blind spots in my own thinking, ways I've accepted police narratives too easily or dismissed defendant claims too quickly. It's changed me. It's made me angry, yes, but more importantly, it's made me more committed to the work of reform, because I now understand in my bones, and not just my brain, that justice isn't automatic. It's a choice we make with every case, every arrest, every moment where we decide whether to see people as human beings or as problems to be solved with force. The press conference ended at 3:45, but the story was just beginning. Within hours, Officer Bradford's history of complaints would be uncovered by investigative reporters. 7 excessive force allegations over 12 years that had all been dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline. Officer Mitchell's connections to 2 of the indicted officers would be revealed, creating a web of relationships that suggested knowledge of and participation in the culture Victoria had described. The store manager at Publix would confirm to multiple outlets that no shoplifting report had ever been called in, that their security had captured Victoria on camera paying for her groceries, and that they had no idea why officers had claimed otherwise. And the dispatch recordings would show no call about a shoplifter at that location at that time, confirming that Bradford and Mitchell had fabricated the entire justification for the stop. Victoria spent 4 hours at Emory University Hospital, where they ran a CT scan for her concussion, x-rayed her ribs and cheekbone, and referred her to an orthopedic surgeon for her shoulder. The attending physician, a middle-aged white man named Dr. Harrison, documented her injuries with the thoroughness of someone who'd testified as an expert witness before and knew exactly what would be needed for court. He took photographs from multiple angles, noted the pattern of bruising consistent with handcuffs applied with excessive force, and included in his report his medical opinion that the injuries were inconsistent with claims of a combative or resistant patient and consistent with application of force against someone who was compliant or unable to resist. That report would become a key piece of evidence, clinical and objective, impossible to dismiss as biased or emotional. Her daughter Jasmine arrived at the hospital at 7 p.m., having caught the first flight from D.C. the moment she'd seen the videos, and the sight of her baby's face crumpling when she saw Victoria's injuries finally broke the composure that had carried Victoria through the press conference and the hospital intake. They cried together in the sterile hospital room while Dr. Harrison tactfully found somewhere else to be, and Jasmine held her mother's good hand and said all the things daughters say when they realize their parents are mortal and vulnerable. That she should have been there, that she should have protected her, that she wanted to hurt the people who'd done this. Victoria smoothed her daughter's hair, natural and curly like her own, and told her that the best protection, the best revenge, was to be exactly who she'd raised Jasmine to be: strong, educated, uncompromising in her values, and committed to making the world better than she found it. Victoria's brother Marcus arrived 2 hours later, having driven from D.C. at speeds that probably violated several traffic laws, and his fury was the cold, calculated kind that came from being a civil rights attorney who'd seen this pattern 1,000 times. He was already talking about federal lawsuits and constitutional violations and discovery processes that would expose every dirty corner of the APD's culture. And Victoria loved him for it, but also needed him to stop being a lawyer for 5 minutes and just be her baby brother. "Marcus, I need you to breathe," she said gently, and watched him collapse into the chair next to her bed like a puppet with cut strings. "I need you to trust that I know how to handle this, that I've been building toward this for 2 years, and that as bad as today was, it's also given me something powerful. It's given me a story that people will actually pay attention to, that will make them care about all the other stories I've been trying to tell." The flashback came later that night when the painkillers had finally kicked in enough for her to rest, but not enough to actually sleep. Her mind drifting back to the beginning of this investigation, to the moment 26 months ago when everything had changed. She'd been sitting in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, reviewing a routine drug possession case, when her door had opened without a knock, and a woman had walked in with the kind of desperate energy that comes from having exhausted every other option. Her name was Patricia Williams, and she was Marcus Williams's mother, and she'd come to the state attorney's office because the district attorney had declined to press charges against the officers who'd beaten her son, citing insufficient evidence despite witnesses and her son's catastrophic injuries. Patricia had brought a folder 3 inches thick, filled with her own investigation. Witness statements she'd collected, medical records, photographs of Marcus before and after, and a timeline that showed the officer's story changing 3 times in the official reports. Victoria had spent 6 hours with Patricia that day, going through every piece of evidence, and had felt the familiar fury building that came from seeing injustice documented but unaddressed. She'd made no promises, had explained the complexities of prosecuting police officers and the high bar for proving criminal intent versus simple incompetence, but she'd also told Patricia the truth. "If what you're showing me is accurate, this isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern, and patterns can be prosecuted." She'd started pulling threads that day, making calls to contacts at the FBI and DOJ, reaching out to civil rights attorneys who specialized in police misconduct, and quietly beginning an investigation that would eventually involve 3 federal agencies, 47 witnesses, and enough evidence to fill 17 indictments. The resistance had started almost immediately. The police union had complained to the mayor about her anti-police bias when word leaked that she was investigating officers. She'd received threatening letters at her office and her home, detailed enough that she'd had to involve FBI protection for 2 months. 3 witnesses had recanted their statements after visits from men they couldn't identify but who'd made it clear that cooperation had consequences. 2 of her investigators had quit, saying the pressure from their families in law enforcement was too intense. And she'd sat through a meeting with the police chief and the mayor, where they both suggested that maybe she was overreaching, that maybe these were just a few bad apples that didn't warrant a major investigation, that maybe she should consider the impact on police morale and community relations. Victoria had listened to their concerns and then placed on the table a photograph of Marcus Williams in his hospital bed, machines breathing for him, his mother holding his hand while doctors explained that he'd never fully recover. "This is the impact I'm considering," she'd said quietly. "This is what happens when we prioritize institutional protection over individual justice. This is what happens when we see badges instead of behaviors." So with all due respect, the investigation continues, and either you can support it or you can explain to the public why you chose not to. The meeting had ended shortly after that, and while she hadn't gained their support, she'd at least established that she wouldn't be deterred by political pressure. The second flashback was softer, sweeter, a memory of her husband David the night she'd been appointed state attorney 4 years ago. They'd celebrated at their favorite restaurant in Midtown, a small Italian place that was completely unpretentious despite the quality of the food. And over tiramisu, he'd taken her hand and told her he was proud of her but also worried. "You're going to want to fix everything," he'd said with the gentle knowing that came from 15 years of marriage. "You're going to see every case as a chance to remake the system. And I love that about you, but I also need you to promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll remember that you can't save everyone, and that trying to might cost you parts of yourself that you can't get back." She'd promised, had kissed him and told him that she'd be smart about it, that she wouldn't take unnecessary risks or sacrifice her own well-being for the job. She'd broken that promise in the 2 years since his death, had thrown herself into work with an intensity that worried Jasmine and Marcus and her father. The investigation into police corruption had become her mission, her purpose, the thing that got her out of bed when grief made sleeping in feel preferable to facing another day. David's death had been sudden, a massive heart attack while he was jogging in Piedmont Park, and the randomness of it had shattered her illusion of control. But the investigation was something she could control, something she could see through to completion, something that would matter and last and maybe justify the time she was spending away from processing her loss. Lying in the hospital bed, her body aching from violations that never should have happened, Victoria wondered if David would think she'd kept her promise or broken it spectacularly. The third flashback was to 3 weeks ago, when she'd finalized the indictments with the DOJ attorney assigned to the case, a serious woman named Rebecca Morrison, who'd spent 20 years prosecuting civil rights violations, and who told Victoria that this was one of the strongest cases she'd ever seen. They'd gone through every charge, every piece of evidence, making sure it was airtight, making sure that defense attorneys couldn't find procedural errors or evidentiary gaps to exploit. Rebecca had asked Victoria if she was prepared for the backlash, for the thin blue line closing ranks, for the accusations that she was anti-police or pursuing a political agenda. Victoria had answered honestly that she was terrified but committed, that she knew this would probably end her political future if she'd had won, that she understood there would be consequences both professional and personal. Rebecca had smiled, something warm and approving, and said, "Good. The people who aren't terrified are usually the ones who don't fully understand what they're up against. Fear that you push through is courage. Lack of fear is just ignorance." Victoria had thought about that conversation a lot in the weeks leading up to the press conference, and she thought about it again now in the hospital bed. She'd been terrified when Bradford hit her, when Mitchell wrenched her arms back, when they dragged her across the parking lot. But she'd also felt something else underneath the fear, a kind of vindication, an ugly proof that everything she'd been investigating was real and present and still actively harming people. Her arrest was evidence. Her injuries were evidence. And evidence was what she trusted, what she knew how to use, what would ultimately matter more than any amount of denial or institutional defensiveness. The news coverage over the next 48 hours was relentless and largely sympathetic, which Victoria knew was at least partially because of her position and credentials. A black man arrested under the same circumstances might have had his entire history scrutinized, every traffic ticket and parking violation used to suggest he deserved suspicion. But she was State Attorney Victoria Hayes, Yale Law School graduate, public servant with an impeccable record, and so the coverage focused on the injustice of her arrest rather than searching for ways to justify it. She was aware of the privilege in that, the way her title protected her from the character assassination that so many victims faced, and it made her angry all over again because justice shouldn't require credentials. The internal affairs investigation moved with unusual speed, probably because the evidence was overwhelming and the political pressure was intense. Within 72 hours, Officers Bradford and Mitchell were suspended without pay pending the outcome of both internal and federal investigations. Their union representative gave a press conference calling the suspension premature and insisting they'd followed proper procedures. But the statement fell flat when multiple news outlets ran side-by-side comparisons of the union's claims, with the actual video evidence showing Victoria being struck and dragged. The fabricated shoplifting call became a central focus, with the police chief himself admitting in a press conference that no such call existed, and that the officers appeared to have invented probable cause for the stop. Captain Morrison was placed on administrative leave 3 days after the arrest, when an internal review revealed that he'd received multiple complaints about Bradford over the years and had consistently recommended minimal discipline or no action. 2 other supervisors in his precinct were also reassigned pending investigation into their handling of previous complaints, and the police chief announced a comprehensive review of the department's disciplinary procedures, use of force policies, and complaint investigation processes, essentially admitting that systemic problems existed even while defending the majority of officers as honorable and professional. Victoria's civil rights lawsuit was filed 1 week after the arrest, representing herself along with her brother Marcus and a team of civil rights attorneys from the Southern Poverty Law Center who'd been eager to take the case. The complaint was a masterpiece of legal drafting, 47 pages detailing not just the arrest itself, but the broader context of the department's culture, the pattern of complaints against Bradford, the supervisory failures that allowed him to continue policing despite warning signs, and the municipal policies that created conditions where this kind of arrest was predictable rather than aberrational. The damages sought were both compensatory and punitive, with a number high enough to make the city's finance department pay attention: $50 million to be donated entirely to organizations supporting victims of police brutality if awarded. The criminal indictments against the original 17 officers proceeded on schedule, with the Georgia Attorney General appointing a special prosecutor to handle the cases to avoid any appearance of impropriety. That special prosecutor, a retired judge named Harold Barnes who'd built his reputation on integrity and thoroughness, immediately announced that he'd be adding Victoria's case to his review and would determine within 30 days whether Bradford and Mitchell should face criminal charges in addition to the federal civil rights investigation. The announcement sent a clear message that her position wouldn't result in special treatment, which Victoria appreciated even though every lawyer in the state knew that her case was the strongest of all of them given the video evidence and complete absence of any legitimate probable cause. The preliminary hearings for the 17 indicted officers became a media circus, with each one drawing protesters both supporting and opposing the charges. Victoria attended several, sitting in the gallery with her arm still in a sling, and watched the defense attorneys employ every tactic she'd seen 100 times, attacking witnesses' credibility, suggesting evidence was taken out of context, implying that Monday morning quarterbacking of split-second decisions wasn't fair to officers making life-and-death choices. But the evidence was strong enough that several officers took plea deals rather than go to trial, agreeing to resign, surrender their certifications, and serve probation in exchange for avoiding prison time. The deals were controversial, with victims' families calling them too lenient, but Victoria understood the calculus. Certain accountability was better than the risk of acquittal, and removing these officers from law enforcement permanently was the primary goal. The trials that did go forward resulted in mixed verdicts, some convictions and some acquittals, which was the reality of prosecuting police in a system where juries often gave officers the benefit of the doubt. But even the acquittals came with consequences, as several of the acquitted officers were still fired by the department for policy violations that didn't meet the criminal standard, but were sufficient for termination. Marcus Williams's case resulted in conviction on all counts, with the officer sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, and Patricia Williams held Victoria's good hand in the courtroom when the verdict was read while both of them cried. Destiny Johnson's case ended in a plea deal that Victoria initially opposed, but that Destiny and her therapist supported, believing that avoiding trial testimony would be better for her mental health. Robert Chen's case was complicated by his initial fear to cooperate, but eventually resulted in convictions and deportation proceedings against the officers involved for immigration fraud, in addition to their other charges. Officer Bradford was indicted on federal civil rights charges 11 weeks after Victoria's arrest, facing 5 counts including deprivation of rights under color of law, filing false reports, and assault. Officer Mitchell was offered a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Bradford and his cooperation in the broader investigation of their precinct's culture, a deal that made Victoria's stomach turn, but that the federal prosecutor assured her was necessary to build the strongest case possible. Mitchell's testimony in depositions was damning, describing a culture where supervisors encouraged aggressive policing of certain neighborhoods, where complaints from minority citizens were dismissed as playing the victim, and where officers who questioned tactics were ostracized as disloyal. His description of Bradford specifically included admissions that Bradford had bragged about not taking shit from suspects and had multiple times used force that Mitchell considered excessive, but hadn't reported out of fear of retaliation. Bradford's trial was scheduled for 14 months after the arrest, and in the intervening time, Victoria threw herself back into her work with the intensity of someone trying to outrun trauma. She attended physical therapy 3 times a week for her shoulder, which had required surgery to repair the torn rotator cuff and would never fully regain its original range of motion. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in PTSD, recognizing that the nightmares and hypervigilance she was experiencing weren't things she could just willpower through. And she continued prosecuting cases, holding press conferences, pushing for reforms with the same determination that had defined her career, but now with an edge of personal experience that made her words carry different weight. The mayor formed a task force on police reform 6 months after the arrest, and appointed Victoria as co-chair, along with a community organizer named Reverend James Mitchell, who'd been calling for police accountability for 30 years. Together, they held town halls across Atlanta, listening to stories that ranged from heartbreaking to enraging, documenting patterns that existed not just in official complaints, but in the lived experiences of communities that had learned not to trust that complaints would matter. The task force's recommendations were sweeping: mandatory body cameras with severe penalties for failures, civilian review board with subpoena power, early intervention systems for officers showing warning signs, elimination of qualified immunity for civil suits, and mandatory diversification of recruiting and training. Some recommendations were adopted, others were watered down, and several were blocked entirely by the police union. But the conversation had shifted in ways that felt meaningful even when the outcomes were incomplete. Victoria's own lawsuit settled 18 months after the arrest for an undisclosed sum that sources told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was in the range of $12 million, far less than the $50 million sought, but still one of the largest police misconduct settlements in Georgia history. True to her word, Victoria donated the entire amount to a newly created foundation called the David Hayes Justice Fund, named for her late husband and dedicated to providing legal representation, medical care, and counseling for victims of police misconduct. The foundation's first act was to hire 5 full-time attorneys who would work exclusively on civil rights cases, ensuring that people without Victoria's resources could still fight back against abuses. Officer Bradford's trial lasted 3 weeks and ended with conviction on 4 of 5 counts, with sentencing guidelines suggesting 8 to 12 years in federal prison. The courtroom was packed for the verdict, and Victoria sat in the front row with Patricia Williams, Destiny Johnson, Robert Chen, and a dozen other victims whose cases had been part of the broader investigation. When the jury foreman read guilty for the first count, she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, wasn't revenge or even justice in the pure sense. It was accountability. It was the system working the way it was supposed to, even if it had taken extraordinary effort and personal cost to make that happen. Bradford's sentencing 3 months later resulted in 10 years, and the judge's statement from the bench included language about betrayal of public trust and the necessity of holding those with power to higher standards rather than lower ones. The reforms continued in waves over the following years, imperfect and incomplete but undeniably real. Officer training programs were overhauled to include de-escalation and implicit bias components. The Civilian Review Board began actually investigating complaints with teeth, resulting in discipline that supervisors had previously declined to impose. Body camera policies were strengthened to the point that malfunctions dropped by 93%. Funny how that worked when officers faced real consequences for mysterious technical failures. And recruitment slowly began to diversify, bringing in officers who looked like the communities they served and who had been trained in a new culture that emphasized guardianship over warrior mentality. Victoria served out her term as state attorney and then made the decision not to run for re-election, instead accepting a position as a professor at Emory University School of Law, where she could teach the next generation of prosecutors and defense attorneys about the complexities of seeking justice within a flawed system. Her course on prosecutorial ethics became the most popular in the school, partly because of her name recognition, but mostly because she taught with the kind of hard-earned wisdom that only comes from living through failure and success in equal measure. She was honest with her students about her mistakes, about the cases where she'd been too quick to trust police narratives, about the ways that her own position and privilege had blinded her to realities that others experienced daily. She guest lectured at law schools across the country, always telling the story of her arrest not as a tale of personal victimization, but as a lesson about systemic problems and the necessity of reform from within institutions. She wrote a book, Justice Interrupted, one prosecutor's journey from certainty to doubt to action, that became required reading in criminal justice programs and sparked conversations about how people in power could use their positions to challenge rather than reinforce oppressive systems. And she stayed involved in police reform efforts, serving on national task forces and consulting with other jurisdictions trying to implement the kinds of changes that Atlanta had begun. Her daughter Jasmine graduated from Howard with a degree in criminal justice and immediately enrolled in law school, telling her mother that watching her fight back after the arrest had shown her what courage looked like, and that she wanted to spend her life doing the same kind of work. Marcus continued his civil rights practice in D.C., but collaborated with Victoria on several major cases, and their sibling partnership became legendary in legal circles for its combination of Victoria's prosecutorial precision and Marcus's aggressive advocacy. And her father, who'd initially been terrified that the arrest would break his daughter the way his sons had contributed to breaking him years ago, instead watched her transform pain into purpose and told her he'd never been more proud. On the 5-year anniversary of her arrest, Victoria returned to that Publix parking lot in Buckhead, and she stood in the spot where Bradford had struck her, where her groceries had scattered, where she'd been handcuffed and dragged. The spot looked completely ordinary in the afternoon sun, just asphalt and parking lines and shopping carts, no physical evidence remaining of what had happened there. But she could still feel the echo of it, the way trauma leaves impressions that outlast visible scars. She'd brought flowers, which felt strange but right, and she placed them near the storm drain where her ID had almost fallen, a small memorial to the person she'd been before that day, and the person she'd become after. A few people recognized her, asked to take photos, thanked her for her work, and she graciously accepted their appreciation while feeling the complicated mixture of gratitude and discomfort that came with being treated as a symbol rather than a person. But one interaction stood out. A young black woman, maybe 25, who approached hesitantly and said that she'd been arrested 2 weeks ago under circumstances that felt wrong, and she didn't know what to do or who to call. Victoria spent 20 minutes in that parking lot, getting the woman's information, connecting her with the David Hayes Justice Fund, and walking her through her options with the same care and attention she'd give any client. Because that was the point, ultimately. Not the press conferences or the reforms or the book or the accolades, but this, one person helping another navigate a system that was designed to be navigated more easily by some than others. Victoria Hayes had been wrongfully arrested on a Saturday afternoon 5 years ago, and in the moments after, everything had changed. But the change wasn't instantaneous or magical. It was hard work and painful recovery, and strategic litigation, and community organizing and political pressure and media attention, and 1,000 small decisions to keep fighting even when the outcome was uncertain. It was the decision to use her privilege and platform not to insulate herself from the system's flaws, but to illuminate them for others. It was the choice to see her worst day not as the end of her story, but as a chapter in a larger narrative about accountability and justice, and the ongoing work of making systems serve the people they're meant to protect. The reforms she'd fought for weren't perfect. Police brutality hadn't ended. Racism hadn't been solved. The criminal justice system still failed people every day in ways that were predictable and preventable. But the Atlanta Police Department had changed in measurable ways, and those changes had rippled out to other jurisdictions. And the national conversation had shifted in directions that created space for more changes. And every person who'd been helped by the foundation, every officer who'd been held accountable, every victim who'd seen justice served, was evidence that the work mattered even when it was incomplete. Victoria drove home that evening thinking about all the people she'd met over the past 5 years whose names would never trend on social media, whose arrests would never be viral videos, whose struggles against the system happened in obscurity without the protection of titles or credentials or platforms. She thought about how her story had mattered partly because of who she was, and how that was both useful and deeply unjust. And she renewed her commitment to using whatever voice and influence she had to amplify the stories of those without her advantages, to ensure that justice wasn't reserved for people with law degrees and media connections, but was instead the birthright of every person regardless of their position or power. The work continued. The fight continued. And Victoria Hayes, 5 years removed from the worst day of her professional life, continued as well, carrying her scars and her lessons and her determination forward into whatever came next, knowing that change was possible because she'd lived it, imperfect and incomplete but undeniably real.